is going to instruct you on 15 different watercolor techniques. I've also provided you with a page that lists all 15 techniques as well as descriptions for each one. The first thing that you're going to need to do is gather your supplies. You'll need a paint palette, you will need some paper towels, a variety of paintbrushes is a good idea. I have small containers of salt, a cup with water, some masking tape, saran wrap, and a tissue. You may also want a white crayon or a white oil pastel. First thing you want to do is take your 4x4 squares and label one technique on each square. So you should have 15 squares total. We're going to start with a flat wash. When you go to mix up your colors, use the inside of your palette lid. Don't use the colors directly out of the container. These colors tend to be very primary and very intense. They're not realistic colors. So please make sure that you are mixing your colors as you work. Also keep in mind with watercolors, if you go straight from the container, it's very thick, and if you want a thinner wash, you need to add more water. We don't have white in watercolors, so you can't make a tint by adding white. You make a tint by adding more water. For a flat wash, I have a large flat brush, and I'm going to start by running a bead of my color across the top of my page. If you tilt your paper, you're going to notice that that bead of color sits along the bottom of that brush stroke. I'm going to load my paintbrush again and run another bead that overlaps that little pool of color. And I'm going to continue to do this, filling up my whole square with one even color that doesn't have or has very few value changes, so that it's one flat color. I'm going to fix up my edge here. And in order to get rid of the extra paint that you have at the bottom, I rinse out my brush, I dry off my brush, and you can run your brush then very gently along that, and your brush will absorb any extra paint that you have. Here's another example of a dry, finished flat wash. Next, we're going to move on to graded wash, which the technique is similar. You're going to start with your color, pull it across the top. I want a little bit more intense of a color here. But rather than loading up your paintbrush with the paint each time, we're going to load your paintbrush with water. So I just do a small dip into my water container and still overlap that original color. And as you move down and you continue adding more water, your value will change and get lighter and lighter as it moves down the paper. And here's another example of a graded wash. Next, we're going to look at blending. So you're going to need to prepare two colors that would mix nicely. So I have this blue violet. I'm also going to have a red violet. I'm going to start with my red violet at the top of my paper, very similar to what I did with my flat wash and my graded wash. And as I move down, I'm going to start to introduce my other color. So this time, instead of dipping back into the original color or dipping into the water, I'm just slowly adding more and more of my blue violet. You should get a blended effect. Here is an example of a finished, dry, blended piece. Next, we'll work with wet and wet. This can be very fun. You can start by just putting water onto your watercolor paper, or you can work with colors. I'm going to actually start with just water. Ooh, I have a little bit of color in my paintbrush. So you're going to lay down either a color or clear water, and then you can start to add colors into this. You're going to notice that you get really soft edges and a lot of bleeding going on. So if that's the look that you're going for, then wet and wet is the way to go. Here is an example of a finished one. Next, we're going to play with water on wet. So this is where you're going to lay down a color. You can use that flat wash technique or kind of do what I'm doing and just quickly lay down a color. And this time you're going to just take water, clear water, and start to dab or drag that throughout, and you're going to notice that that water pools and moves outward and you get these really neat kind of water spot effects. When it's dry, you might get something that looks a little bit like that, depending on how much the water moves. This is a good one to play around with how wet is your color before you put the water in as well, because you're going to get different effects. So that's kind of a neat one to play around with. Next, we're going to work with wet on dry. So you have to have something that's already dry before you do this one. So I've already gone ahead and painted in a shape here, and I'm going to add something on top then. What you're going to notice with wet on dry is that you keep those hard edges of the original shape. It can be very difficult to be patient with watercolor and let it dry, but students often find frustration when they try to paint another color next to an existing one and the first one isn't dry yet, so they will bleed together. If you wait until it's dry, you can continue to have that hard edge that you're looking for. And here's another, this one you can tell it wasn't completely dry, so actually I did have a little bit of bleeding there that happened. So if it's not completely dry, don't put your second color on yet. Next, we're going to take a look at dry brush. With dry brush, I'm going to make sure my brush is clean and dry. And I'm going ahead and dip my brush in flat into my paint color. And I might even go back in and dry off the opposite side on my paper towel. And now you can play around with what kinds of brush strokes and textures you might be able to get with that dry brush. Again, play around with how much paint is in your paintbrush, how much water is in your paintbrush, and you can create a lot of different effects that way. Try different paintbrushes too. You don't have to just use a flat brush in order to do dry brush. You could use a smaller brush as well. With wax resist, you're going to need a crayon or an oil pastel. It seems more magical when you use white. So you're going to draw a picture with either crayon or oil pastel, and then you can go ahead and paint over that to reveal your image or your drawing underneath. And here's an example of a finished wax resist. Masking tape resist. This is where you can go ahead and use masking tape. It's often a good idea to put the masking tape down on your pants and lift up. That way you get some of the fibers from the fabric on the back of the masking tape, and it's less likely to remove the top layer of your paper while you're working. And you could use larger masking tape and cut it into a shape if you wanted to, or you could create a design, or you could edge something that already exists with the masking tape. And then you can go ahead and paint over that. And this will create a nice hard edge. And when you are finished, when it's dry, you may remove the masking tape and you will wind up with something that looks a little bit like that. With stippling, it's a good idea to use a brush that has very pointy bristles. So I've gone ahead and pulled out this brush, and you're going to dip this into your paint, and then you can go ahead and create a stippled effect here. Try this with different brushes as well and see what you come up with. Here's an example of a finished one of those. For splatter, there's a couple different ways that you can do splatter. It's a good idea to have very watered down paint for splatter, and you can kind of throw the paint at your paper. You can try and tap the paint on your paper. You can also use a toothbrush and flick the paint at your paper as well. And you're going to get different effects with each one of these. So play around with splatter as well. Here you can see some of the different effects. This was the larger where I was throwing the paint, and over here we get some of the lighter that was from the toothbrush. With indenting, you are going to start by laying down a color. Let's see, I'm running out of my blue violet here. All right, you're going to start by laying down a color. And then you can go ahead and use a sharp tool. Even just the back of your paintbrush will work. And you can draw onto the paper that way in order to create patterns and textures. And here is a finished example. With salt, you're going to lay down your color. And I have two different types of salt in these containers for you. One has a larger grain of salt and one has a smaller grain of salt. You're going to take the salt and sprinkle it onto your paper. This is also a great one to play with. How wet does your paper need to be? Does the salt react more if you have more watery paint, or does it react differently when it's a little bit drier? You do need to let the salt stay on the surface until it is dry. Here's an example that is almost dry, and then you can go ahead and remove the salt in order to get this texture. With tissue, you're going to start by laying down your color. And this time you're going to grab a tissue that you can then start to blot at different areas. Play around with, what happens if you roll the tissue across the surface and the different kinds of textures that you can get from that. And here is a finished example of that one. And lastly, with plastic wrap, you're going to lay down a color. And you're going to get yourself a piece of plastic wrap. And you can manipulate the plastic wrap and move it around until you get something that you like. And then you need to let this dry with the plastic wrap on it. And when you are finished, you will end up with something that looks a little bit like that. If you need to go back and watch this video, you can rewatch any part of it to review any of these techniques, and let me know if you need assistance.